Hello and welcome to a run through of Matthew Arnold's poem Alaric at Rome. It's a poem I like to scan through every now and then, and I thought I'd do a video where I run through it. It's his first poem in terms of he published it at the age of 17. As you can see here, it was a prize poem, 1840, as he was leaving Rugby School. Matthew Arnold in 1840, Matthew Arnold being born in 1822. He was about to matriculate in Balliol College, Oxford, which is a whole setting which was going to go on to define Matthew Arnold's career, aura, person, being. But for now, he was bidding goodbye to his rugby days and hello to his Oxford days, and he writes this poem. It's an indication of who Arnold would become. There's a lot of pieces of Arnold in here that we can see in later parts of his poetry. It's an interesting glimpse into Arnold. Filter out the Oxford stuff. Where was he before that? Where was he at the age of 17? I mean, the maturity of this poem, we can go through that to deal with this subject. The subject is, of course, Alaric and the Visigoth sack of Rome, 410 AD. It's about the end of Rome, and yet the eternal, still the eternal city. So there's some sort of alluring grandeur that Arnold's trying to figure out. How can there be that sense of eternity and yet that same destructive event? And so it's a sort of meditation upon that. Alaric, Visigoth, leader of the Visigoths from 395 to 410. Of course, sack of Rome coming right at the end of his life. Alaric, as we can see when we go through this poem, doesn't last much longer than the sack itself. And that's kind of crucial to Arnold's his intimations and his thoughts. But Alaric, before this, the sack, he'd already gotten lands in Moesia, kind of modern day Serbia, from the Eastern Roman Empire, and he'd been sacking Athens and so on. So he was a known figure. It was not a complete bolt from the blue. But I'm sure I'm speaking to learned people who've already their gibbet. So I'll get into the poem itself then. Of course, it was a prize-winning poem. Dr. Thomas Arnold would have been Matthew's father and the headmaster in rugby, who set up this whole sort of ethos of the rugby prefect and so on. So the fact Arnold could produce a poem like this, I think, would have filled him with great pride. And he starts with an epitaph from Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Admire, exult, despise, laugh, weep, for here there is much matter for all feeling. Now, this year is 1840. So Childe Harold's Pilgrimage comes out 1812 to 1818 in installments. Of course, there's 4 cantos to that. And the Byronic mania, which would have existed just before Arnold's birth, I think Arnold is still soaking some of that up. So of course, as a teenager, if you're into poetry, he's going certainly at that age in that decade, you're going to get into Byron and his adventures in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The Childe Harold, which in essence is Byron himself, those adventures. So Canto 1 takes you through Spain, 2 to Greece, 3 down through the Rhine, past the battlefields of Waterloo, and 4, crucially, Canto 4, into Italy, which would have inspired Arnold a lot. So we both have the romantic language aspect inspiring Arnold, and then also literally the fact that Childe Harold visits these ruins and has all of his own permutations. So Arnold would have seen that he wanted to echo that and mirror that. So let's start with, there's 38 stanzas to this. Each one is a sestain, so 6 lines. The rhyming scheme is AB, AB, CC, which is the same, I think, as Shakespeare's Venus of Adonis, and it's certainly well worn in European literature more widely. I think it's a little bit less common in English poetry, but it is there. Shakespeare would have written in it. And the meter, so that's different to Childe Harold. Childe Harold is a strange scheme. I think it's, if I actually have it up here, that just to find some corresponding texts. So there's some letters to Inez where it breaks, but usually it holds this pattern where it's A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. So sort of strange pattern, but you can see it ends on a long Alexandrine line there. There's an echo of that here where The first 5 are in iambic pentameter, and then there's the longer line at the end, which is in iambic hexameter. So nothing too mad, but a little echo to that, like you elongate the the last line in that seste. Okay, so let's get into it. Unwelcome shroud of the forgotten dead, oblivion's dreary fountain, where art thou? Why speedst thou not thy deathlike wave to shed o'er humbled pride and self-reproaching woe? Or time's stern hand, why blots it not away the saddening tale that tells of sorrow and decay? There are whose glory passeth not away, even in the grave their fragrance cannot fade. Others there are as deathless full as they, who for themselves a monument have made, by their own crimes a lesson to all eyes, of wonder to the fool, of warning to the wise. These opening lines have the largest echoes of Byron. It's romantic language, like oblivion's dreary fountain. It's almost overdoing it in just how powerful and how wearisome this language is. It's not just oblivion. It's oblivion's dreary fountain. It's not just dreary, right? And both of these lines, I think, if we find them here, this is Charles Harold's Pilgrimage. Oblivion. You can see it occurs 3 times. Here's an instance of it. With the grey stones and unmolested grass, ages but not oblivion, feebly brave. You can see that language is definitely being echoed here in Oblivion's dreary fountain. And also the call out to the monument. I think, sorry, just to bring it home, we also have dreary. I mean, the beginning of the second canto. But worse than steel and flame and ages slow is the drear scepter. And then dreary, it also occurs. Dreary strain, this sort of thing. So he's picking up on that Byronic language. And then also the echo, not only of dreary, of down and below, and a sinking feeling, but also he needs to bring back in. So Stanzas 1 and 2 are a sort of answer and reply motif, where he says, how can everything be so full of this woe and decay, but it blots not away. There are things that, and of course, the crucial word in stanza 2 is monument. The monuments last. Why do they have this lasting answer? There are those whose glory passeth not away. Why? He's trying to understand this. And again, this idea of monuments is wrapped up in Childe Harold. So we look for monuments and we see a few instances here. They made themselves a fearful monument. And if a pyramid formed of this monumental fane, this is the sort of language. And then finally in 3, we close out the sort of build up to it, where he has this back and forth. Why does this not go away? Why are there these monuments that fade not with time? There seems to be some sort of glory which lasts here. And then stanza 3, answering in the affirmative. Yes, there are stories registered on high. Yes, there are stains time's fingers cannot blot, deeds that shall live when they who did them die. Things that may cease, but never be forgot. Yet some there are, their very lives would give, to be remembered thus, and yet they cannot live. And then finally, after this intro, full of Byronic language, we get into Rome. Not stated by name, right? He doesn't want to, he wants us to, he knows the audience will understand he's talking about Rome. He doesn't need to say it. And there's power in that. There's power in the city. But thou imperial city, right, what else could he be talking about? That hast stood in greatness once, in sackcloth now and tears, a mighty name for evil or for good, even in the loneness of thy widowed years, thou that hast gazed as the world hurried by upon its headlong course with sad prophetic eye. So there's a good juxtaposition here. In greatness once, in sackcloth now and tears. So greatness is an abstract thing. Greatness and what gives it its lasting legacy, Rome as a city, is this essence greatness where you cannot capture it as a material thing, yet then its destruction can absolutely get categorized in such sackcloth. So we have something slightly more spiritual in greatness, something abstract, something that only the human conscious can grasp. In greatness once, and then in sackcloth now in tears. Materiality is the mundane, and that echoes throughout the poem. He does admit here it's in its widowed years, right? this sack comes in 410. It's not the bolt from the blue. It is not a shock. In essence, Rome, I think the capitals had been moved to Mediolanum and then on to Ravenna at this point. So there's nothing shocking politically about this. Rome had been sort of in a long decay by now, but the eternal city, the imperial city, still holds that weight. There was something, it was a spiritual heart of Rome, even if the legislature and the court of the emperor had moved. It was in its widowed years. And that's a nice phrase from Arnold to describe where it was. And the final couplet reminds me of, in essence, the words of Petronius and T.S. Eliot in his Wasteland brings this up. When Petronius talks about seeing the Sibyl, and I have it here. Again, you can see this as an instance of the Wasteland, but it's actually when he echoes Petronius's Satyricon, where Petronius says he sees this Sibyl, and she had said she wanted long, everlasting life to Apollo. And he grants it to her, but she ages. She cannot stop but aging. So by the time Petronius sees her in his poem Satyricon, she's rotting in a cage. She's this old crone. And he says, Nam Sibyllam quidem cumis ego ipse oculus meus vidi in ampula pendere et cum illi pueri dicarent. Sibylla titelies respondebat illa. And she responded thus. He asked, what do you want? And she answers, apothanian tello. I want to die. So there's that echo to the these final couplet here. Thou hast gazed as the world hurried by upon its headlong course with sad prophetic eye. And so he carries on with Rome. Is thine the laurel crown that greatness wreathes round the wan temples of the hallowed dead? And this idea of hallowed or unhallowed is throughout. The hallowedness of Rome, the unhallowedness of the Visigoths, of the cruel barbarians. Round the wan temples of the hallowed dead, is it the blighting taint dishonor breathes in fires undying o'er the guilty head, or the brief splendor of that meteor light that for a moment gleams and all again is night? Fain would we deem that thou hast risen so high, thy dazzling light an eagle's gaze should tire. No meteor brightness to be seen and die, no passing pageant, born but to expire, but full and deathless as the deep dark hue of ocean's sleeping face or heaven's unbroken blue. So here we see another call out, a subtle call out to the Icarus motif, right? There's two contrasts going on here. The blinding, burning, this yellow, white bit in the first half of this stanza, and then the blue, the deep depths of blue, which of course where Icarus falls to after his flight. So there's this element of, did Rome fly too close to the sun? He's using that motif. He doesn't state it explicitly, but it's there. And also the eagle imagery, so we can picture, the symbol of Rome itself as we're talking about this motif. He uses the meteor rather than a meteoric brightness. We talk about meteoric rises and falls, so it gets that idea of something coming towards a hard crash here. We'll move on to 7. Yet stains there are to blot thy brightest page. Now, he's obsessed with blots throughout, right? That there is an essence, a narrative to a city and a civilization, and it can be blotted or unblotted, or then also history can try to blot you away. Just the progress of time will try and do that naturally. Yet stains there are to blot thy brightest page, and wither half the laurels on thy tomb. Glorious manhood, yet a dim old age, the allusion to the long decline. And years of crime and nothingness and gloom, and then that mightiest crash, that giant fall. Ambition's boldest dream might sober and appall. So here's another ongoing theme Arnold's going to bring in. The dream is drunk almost. When you dream, you are drunk. You are in a spiritual ascendancy almost. And then the sobriety appalls. Sobriety is reality, but it's the material reality in particular. So the dream is growth, and the sobriety is the crash. Thou wondrous chaos, where together dwell, present and past, the living and the dead, thou shattered mass, whose glorious ruins tell the vanished might of that discrowned head, where all we see or do or hear or say seems strangely echoed back by tones of yesterday. So the wondrous chaos almost brings in a bit of Carlyle to it, right? Carlyle talks about this dark chaos, this energetic chaos that the French Revolution descends to, that these regimes descend to upon their collapse. Arnold brings that in, though. If we use this, so French Revolution would have come out 1837. Arnold probably wouldn't have read it, but perhaps would have caught up on certain themes. Past and Present comes out 1843. So though some of this is in between the different works, I think Great Man of History, that those 6 lecture series on heroism come out 1841 in Carlyle. So this is written right in the midst of that Carlyle stream. Yet there are little bits of it there, that wondrous chaos in particular, pointing out to also the chaos alludes to, in terms of poetic heritage, of English poetic heritage, Milton brings his Eden, the creation of the world in Paradise Lost, out of a chaos. Right? It's a dark chaos. So there's echoes of Milton there. And as we said, there are glorious, as we mentioned, the dreams and the sobriety, but there are glorious ruins in part 8, whose glorious ruins tell. Another fixation and occurring motif is these oxymorons of how ruins and shattered physical things can uplift the spiritual of the viewer. So it's an oxymoronic little phrase there, glorious ruins, but that's the effect Rome has on Arnold. Thou solemn grave, where every step we treads on the slumbering dust of other years, the while there sleeps within thy precincts dread what once had human passions, hopes, and fears, and memory's gushing tide swells deep and full, makes thy very ruin fresh and beautiful. So he elaborates on that, on what we listed before. Alas, no common sepulture art thou, no habitation for the nameless dead, green turf above and crumbling dust below, perchance some mute memorial at their head, but one vast fane where all unconscious sleep, earth's old heroic forms in peaceful slumbers deep. So earth's old heroic forms, that is a strange one, because you have the earth so far as being that material space, it's the crashing down, yet earth's old heroic forms are sort of renewing themselves. I almost think of that as a Splenglerian cycle. There is a growth and renewal coming out of the old heroic forms when Arnold is perceiving it, out of a slumber, out of something deep. Thy dead are kings, thy dust are palaces, relics of nations, thy memorial stones, and the dim glories of departed days fold like a shroud around thy withered bones, and o'er thy towers the wind's half-uttered sigh whispers in mournful tones thy silent elegy. So again, we had a call out to the widowed years of Rome, and there's similar stuff here. Withered bones. So widowed years matched with the withered bones. We have a second use of the shroud, which was used in stanza 1. And then a good motif here is the personification of the wind. So writing this in 1840, many people wouldn't have seen Rome themselves, and so you need something for the reader to latch onto, to put them in the setting of Arnold viewing the ruins. He uses here the wind, right? Everyone can understand the wind blowing upon their face. It's something that is eternal. You can go outside and experience it. And so he says that the wind itself is, in the personification, its half-uttered sigh of whispers as you stare on the ruins, and that latches the reader into that scene. They can understand it easier. Yes, in such eloquent silence didst thou lie, when Goth, so the first mention of the Goths, he takes it all the way until stanza 12, before he talks about the Goths at all. Yes, in such eloquent silence didst thou lie, when Goth stooped upon his stricken prey, and the deep hues of an Italian sky flashed on the rude barbarians' wild array, while full and ceaseless as the ocean roll, horde after horde streamed up thy frowning capital. So again, he's always used the ocean and deep dark hues and blue with the collapse. So horde after horde, he says this is like the ocean waves lapping. And of course, that you think of time, right? The erosion of the coast comes to mind. So hordes upon hordes lapping upon Rome, eroding it. Deep hues of the Italian sky kind of echo that, but there's a difference to the hues of the sky and the sea. The sky will ultimately be heaven. It's calm. It's eternal, everlasting, looking over the earth, which has the permeability to it. So then we start to get in closer to 410. He gets into a bit more of the actual sack of the city itself now, beginning. Twice ere that day of shame, the embattled foe had gazed in wonder on that glorious sight. Twice had the eternal city bowed her low in sullen homage to the invader's might. Twice had the pageant of that vast array swept from thy walls, O Rome, on its triumphant way. So that's, where was it? 2 up, 3 up? You talk, on 10. Earth's old heroic forms. Well, this is a heroic form here, this motif here. Twice. Now, usually in the Homeric poems and the epic poems, this is a thrice, right? Thrice he was engaged and thrice he came victorious. Here, it was the third sack of Rome, which was the third siege of Rome, which became the sack of Rome. So there was earlier sieges by Alaric in 408 and 409. That's what Arnold's alluding to here, that these twice he came up against the bulwark and was pressed down twice in. So he uses the motif, but he uses twice instead of thrice because it was the third time that actually gave the sack itself. And he carries on with the twice motif in stanza 14. Twice from without thy bulwark hath the din of Gothic clarion smote thy startled ear. Anger and strife and sickness are within. Famine and sorrow are no strangers here. Twice hath the cloud hung o'er thee, twice been stayed, even in the act to burst, twice threatened, twice delayed. Yet once again, stern chief, yet once again, pour forth the foaming vials of thy wrath. There lies thy goal, to miss or to attain. Gird thee, and on upon thy fateful path. The world hath bowed to Rome, O cold, while he, who would not burst his bonds and in his turn be free. There's an allusion there to wrath. This is the first proper echo of the pagan Christian dualism, which is built up in the idea of the sack. Of course, the sack itself, some blame Christianity on it, and Augustine has to write his City of God in response to that. So, Alaric is the pagan. Rome had recently turned Christian. So there was this whole thing about if you let us have our pagan practices within the walls of Rome, then the city might be spared. This whole delegation was happening in the earlier sieges, 409. So caught up in the sack is a Christian pagan dualism. And with the giving of the wrath there to Alaric, right? The stern chief there is Alaric. These vials of his wrath, they give him one of the deadly sins. Or Arnold gives him in particular. Therefore arise and arm thee. Now there's a panic. Now there's a call to arms after all these stanzas of slumber. Lo, the world looks on in fear, and when the seal is set, the doom pronounced, the battle flag unfurled, scourge of the nations, wouldst thou linger yet? Arise and arm thee, spread thy banners forth, pour from 1,000 hills thy warriors of the north. Hast thou not marked on a wild autumn day, when the wind slumbereth in a sudden lull, what deathlike stillness o'er the landscape lay? So there's going to be this one last pause of that intake of breath before the sack. Sudden lull and a deathlike stillness is the words. Good use of vocabulary there from Arnold to set that little. There's the intake of breath and there's a slight pause before the strike. How calmly sad, how sadly beautiful. How each bright tint of tree and flower and heath, while mingling with the sere and withered hues of death. So we have another allusion to withered. We had withered bones before. And, there's an element to this stanza which brings in um, that idea of the lost innocence, even of 1914, in the English poetic tradition. Think of Edward Thomas's Adelstrop, where he talks of the birds murmuring as the train stops, and there's this quiet bit. Now he doesn't. It's a smaller poem. All the birds of Oxfordshire, I think he talks about. So he sets you in the setting, and he gives you plants and bird song, and the last dream of innocent England in 1914. That has the same effect on people. It's that stillness because we know as reader that the Great War is coming, so it has that effect. He's playing on the similar themes here, where there's just a small intake, and then in the intake, suddenly you take in all these details, each bright tint of tree and flower and heath. It's something to the human psyche that the detail is suddenly sucked in for that last moment of stillness before carnage. And thus beneath the clear, calm vault of heaven, in mournful loveliness that city lay, and thus amid the glorious hues of even, that city told of languor and decay. So I mentioned that the vault of the sky is heaven. It's different sort of blue it is vast and unconquerable as the ocean deep, but it's not the same. There's a sense of eternity to the sky in Arnold's language here. Till what at morning's hour look warm and bright was cold and sad beneath that breathless, voiceless night. And it all happens under heaven's watch. Again, the pagan Christian dualism. Soon was that stillness broken, like the cry of the hoarse onset of the surging wave, or louder rush of whirlwinds sweeping by, was the wild shout those Gothic myriads gave, as towered on high above their moonlit road. Scenes where a Caesar triumphed, or a Scipio trod. The stillness is broken. It's a wildness, like wild stout of those Gothic. They are barbarians. And then the first allusion to this is where Caesar was, this is where Scipio was. There's not much of that in the poem. He could have gone back in to say a bit more on Scipio. He talks about Rome and the resurgence of Rome in bits later on, where you still have echoes of Petrarch, but it's always echoes. This is actually an explicit call out to Caesar and Scipio. And of course, Petrarch wrote his Africanus meant on Scipio. So the Renaissance and the reflowering of Roman culture is tied up in that figure of Scipio somewhat through Petrarch. But Arnold doesn't, he just gives us a little glimpse here. Maybe this is an indication that perhaps he's 17, right? It's a little bit jarring that sometimes he stays away from the direct call-outs, but here we do see Caesar and Scipio explicitly put into the poem. Think ye it strikes too slow, the sword of fate? Think ye the avenger loiters on his way, that your own hands must open wide the gate? So famously, one of the gates was opened. There's thoughts of whether it was through hunger, because it was under siege, hadn't been relieved, or treachery. So there's an allusion to that there. The Romans themselves opened the gates. That your own hands must open wide the gate. And that's the thing. I did a stream last night on or 2 nights ago on the final part of going through Churchill's biography with guest Dominus. And there's a quote by Churchill: "He could have protected the empire from everyone but itself." That there is always the self-inflicted element to this. Opened by your own hands is the gate, and your own voices guide him to his prey, him being Alaric. Alas, it needs not. Is it hard to know? Fate's threatenings are not vain. The spoiler comes not slow. And were there none to stand and weep alone? And as the pageant swept before their eyes, to hear a dim and long forgotten tone tell of old times and holiest memories, till fanciful regret and dreamy woe peopled night's voiceless shades with forms of long ago. This is the transition here. With the opening of the gate, he's transitioned into not being himself. He's no longer himself gazing on the ruin. He's beginning to try and get inside the people of Rome's heads here as they saw the destruction. As the monuments are destroyed, as the weight of what those monuments truly are flashes before their eyes, finally, it had been sleeping for centuries. Did the inhabitants, who perhaps opened the door to Alaric themselves see the flashes of greatness one last time? Did it suddenly reveal itself in its destruction? After the long slumber. Oh yes, if fancy feels beyond today, thoughts of the past and future time. Again, this juxtaposition that in the wondrous monuments, the glorious monuments, you have past and future twinning together. Something spiritual is going on once you have overcome time like that. Thoughts of the past and future time. How should that mightiest city pass away, and not the thinker of a glorious prime, whilst every chord that thrills the thoughts of home, jarred with the bursting shout, they come, the Goth, they come. The trumpet swells yet louder. They are here. Yea, on your father's bones the avengers tread. Not this the time to weep upon the bier that holds the ashes of your hero dead. If reeds may twine for you or laurels wave, they shall not deck your life but sanctify your grave. And again, Christian pagan language. There's sanctify there. It's Christian language. Alas, no reeds are here. Despair may teach cowards to conquer and the weak to die. No tongue of man, nor fear, nor shame can preach so stern a lesson as necessity. Yet here it speaks not. Yea, though all around unhallowed feet are trampling on this haunted ground. And there we have necessity is kind of like the sobriety earlier. If you remember, the dreams are drunk, the dreams are ethereal, and the sackcloth is sobriety. The materialism is sobriety, and necessity. That's the crash. And then unhallowed, we had hallowed earlier, right? We had an echo to hallowed monuments. I can't remember explicitly what it was, but these are unhallowed feet on this haunted ground. The ground is no longer sort of hallowed, it's haunted once the unhallowed feet trample on it. Stanza 25. Though every holiest feeling, explicitly holy there, we said we had sanctify, we had Christian language coming in. Every tie that binds the heart of man with mightiest power, all natural love, all human sympathy, be crushed and outraged in this bitter hour. Here is no echo of the sound of home. And we'll see this now, that in the destruction, Arnold will start to associate Alaric's wandering. And so we'll bring in the other epic, right? Odysseus. And that search for home, because of course with the destruction of something as solid as Rome, what is nostos? What is that appeal to want to go back to home? You see it beginning here. There is no echo of the sound of home, no shame that shuns should rise to light a conquered Rome. That troublous night is over. We take a pause after that. On the brow of thy stern hill, thou mighty capital, one form stands gazing silently below. The morning mists from tower and temple roll, and lo, the eternal city as they rise bursts in majestic beauty on her conqueror's eyes. So we have the transition to the minds of the Roman people, and now we're going to have the transition into the mind of Alaric himself, staring over his destruction. Yes, there he stood upon that silent hill, and there beneath his feet his conquest lay, unlike that ocean city, gazing still, smilingly forth upon her sunny bay, but o'er her vanished might and humbled pride, mourning as widowed Venice o'er her Adrian tide. So this is it's a little bit jarring to suddenly bring back in Venice. He's trying to compare here, Arnold, the destruction of Rome with Venice, but he breaks a little bit from this image, I think, of Alaric staring over the destruction. He should have perhaps kept more concretely on that, but the Venice appeal and why he wants to put it in, I believe, is just because Canto 4 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, you have to remember Arnold's still 17 when he wrote this. So he kind of wants to be a Byron. And you see there's elements in here which show that Arnold is never going to be a Byron. It's much more about the still and the calm and the reflection, solitude, remembrance. Byron's much more about action, much more about the frenzy. So let's go to, let's find a Byron instance of Venice. He begins Canto the Fourth, in Venice. And I think it's a call out to that. I stood in Venice, this is Byron, on the bridge of sighs, a palace and a prison in each hand. I saw from out the wave her structures rise, as from the stroke of the enchanter's wand. 1,000 years their cloudy wings expand around me, and a dying glory smiles. So the dying glory smiles. Let's go back to Arnold. We see literally smilingly forth upon her sunny bay when he turns into the image of Venice. So I think it's a direct allusion to the beginning of Canto Fourth, which inspired the poem. O'er the far times when many a subject land looked to the winged lion's marble piles, where Venice sate in state, throned on her 100 isles. So that's sort of the reason why we suddenly see a call out to Venice. I mean, he is trying to compare. Rome really gets that sack moment. Venice doesn't. Venice just gets to, it decays, but still stays there, ossified, staring out on the Adriatic to this day. Breathe there not spirits on the people there. Back to Arnold, 28. Float there not voices on the murmuring wind. Oh, sound there not some strains of sadness there, to touch with sorrow even a victor's mind, and wrest one tear from joy? Oh, who shall pen the thoughts that touched thy breast, thou lonely conqueror then? So he's back to Alaric. That's why yes, it's nice he had the allusion to Venice, but I just don't think it suits in that moment. You have an Alaric standing alone stanza, then suddenly Venice, then Alaric standing alone again. It's a little bit just honing on the Alaric image. It's good. So Alaric is a lonely conqueror as well. That's an interesting motif. Like earlier, when they were in action, wanting to take Rome, Arnold described it as horde after horde, wave upon wave coming upon the city. It's a multitude. It's something you are immersed in the crowd. You've lost your individuality. Now, in the aftermath of the event, the conqueror is alone. And Arnold always in his poetry comes back to that loneliness of the figure from the crowd. The conqueror stands alone. The first man to properly look upon the ruins of Rome is that conqueror in that moment, and he's as lonely as anyone who's ever stared at the wondrous ruins thereafter. But Chance's wandering heart was far away. He tries to get into his mind now, Arnold. He says, what was Alaric thinking in those first moments on that first dawn after 410? Lost in dim memories of his early home. Again, the Odyssean Nostos coming in. Where was his own home? And his young dreams of conquest. How today beheld him master of imperial Rome, crowning his wildest hopes, perchance his eyes, as they looked sternly on, beheld new victor eyes. A little bit there of Tennyson's Ulysses, right, where there's always the next conquest is required. But also, if we're going to keep with the Homeric comparison, we're going to have, Alaric's fate is nothing like Odysseus's. If anything, it's more Achilles, because he is destined to sack Troy and then die. Thus is Alaric destined to sack Rome and perspire before he gets to return anywhere near home or create such thing as a home for himself. So the sack is done. The new dawn is broken. The focus shifted. We had that. Alaric after the frenzy. The conqueror is alone. The wandering heart also, for me, reminds me a little bit of scanning through Toynbee again at the moment. This Folker Wanderung of Toynbee is so twinned with the destruction of Rome and destruction of that civilization. Toynbee twins them together as Greco-Roman. And it's interesting, Alaric was also involved in the taking of Athens. But he has this wandering heart. His is of the Folker Wanderung. It's of a different civilization. It's not Roman. He may have been technically a Roman citizen, I think, Alaric. He was given it after a victory in an earlier battle in the east, in Battle of Adrianople. But he was not Roman. He was not of that civilization. Even Alaric, would have liked to have a home, but he's going to be denied that. As we said, his fate is that of Achilles, more so than Homer. New dreams of wide dominion, mightier, higher. He's still dreaming, still in that, where's my next conquest? Or at least Arnold is saying, did he think of this? Because Arnold begins to admit now, I can't get inside this guy's head. Again, he is of some civilization, some wandering heart that I cannot understand. Come floating up from the abyss of years, perchance that solemn sight might quench the fire. You see, he's saying, well, maybe the solemn sight quenched the fire. Even that ardent spirit, hopes and fears, might well be mingling at that murmured sigh, whispering from all around, all earthly things must die. Perchance that wondrous city was to him but as one voiceless blank, a place of graves and recollections indistinct and dim, whose sons were conquerors once and now are slaves. It may be in that desolate sight his eye saw but another step to climb to victory. Again, did he want to carry on, or was he humbled by this himself, the sight of it? All earthly things must die. All material things will fade. And he's under the dome, the sky. Alas, that fiery spirit little knew the change of life and the nothingness of power. Again, Arnold here talks to the reader going, yeah, we know Alaric's fate. He may not have known it himself, but we do. He'll be dead before the year was out, down in Calabria, south of Italy. He wouldn't even get off the peninsula. How both were hastening as they flowered and grew, nearer and nearer to their closing hour, how every birth of time's miraculous womb swept off the withered leaves that hide the naked tomb. So all, in essence, Alaric has been able to do by his actions is to sweep off the withered leaves to reveal his own naked tomb, not just Rome's. You know, if we go back to Byron's talk of the tomb, he says, Vice digs her own voluptuous tomb. Again, an indication of, 21 matches, right, in the Charles Harold's Pilgrimage of Tomb. So that language is straight from it. I will not look beyond the tomb, but cannot hope for rest before. This is an illustration of how Arnold is different to Byron. Byron sees the tomb, there's no rest before the tomb. But look at the moments we've experienced here. Alaric standing alone above the ruins of Rome. Arnold himself viewing them. I'm not sure if Arnold actually visited them or if he was imagining and taking images from those who had done their Italian journey. There is much rest before the tomb and much time for contemplation in Arnold's world, whereas in Byron there's not. That's where I said you begin to see the flowerings of Arnold's true poetry, which is not just in the shadow of Byron, something different. And here we have it, 33. One little year that restless soul shall rest. Alaric will be dead within the year. That frame of vigor shall be crumbling clay, and tranquilly above the troubled breast the sunny waters hold their joyous sway. And gently shall the murmuring ripples flow, nor wake the weary soul that slumbers on below. Alas, far other thoughts might well be ours. So we're kind of done now. Arnold done with his contemplation. He's going to fade out the same way he faded in. Back to just him and the reader. Him as poet, him as communicator. Alas, for other thoughts might well be ours, and dash our holiest raptures while we gaze. Energies wasted, unimproved hours, the saddening visions of these departed days. And while they rise, here might we stand alone, that isolation and contemplation that Arnold always has in his poetry. Mingle. See, there's no mingling in Byron. Mingle with thy ruins somewhat of our own. Every ruin you see is always somewhat of your own ruin. That's the whole point of Alaric at Rome. Beautiful city. If departed things ever again put earthly likeness on, here should 1,000 forms on fancy's wings float up to tell of ages that are gone. Yea, though hand touch thee not, nor eye should see, still should the spirit hold communion, Rome, with thee. So, as he says, there's something spiritual about Rome's eternal being, its essence. And that's why I use words like communion. Rome's impact upon you viewing their ruins is a communion of something eternal hitting with your spiritual being. It is not material. Oh, it is bitter that each fairest dream, we also had that fancy's wings. Yes, there's a bit of fancy to this. There's a bit of dreamery. but in the dreaming you obtain the spiritual. Oh, it is bitter that each fairest dream should fleet before us, but to melt away. The dreams do melt away. That wildest vision still should loveliest seem and soonest fade in the broad glare of day. So a glare of day, I mean, it's a little bit strange because until now he had been associating, yellow brightness with the flight. Think of the Icarus motif. But here the glare seems to reveal the materiality around him, the mundanity. The dream is gone with the glare of day. That while we feel the world is dull and low, gazing on thee, Rome, or the monuments, we wake to find it is not so. A little while, alas, a little while, and the same world has tongue and ear and eye, and careless glance, the cold, unmeaning smile, the thoughtless word, the lack of sympathy. So Arnold now you can picture him moving back through Victorian London, early Victorian London. Sort of ruthless, harsh industrial landscape. It's a tough world. But who would not turn him from the barren sea and rest his weary eyes on the green land and thee? So the drudgery, the daily life, that's barren. The green land is when you gaze upon the ruins. So pass we on. But oh, to harp aright the vanished glories of thine early day, there needs a minstrel of diviner might. So here we have the humble end, right? I can't talk about your true glories, Rome. I'm not worthy. A holier incense than this feeble lay, to chant thy requiem with more passionate breath, and twine with bolder hand thy last memorial wreath. So I hope you enjoyed this run through of Matthew Arnold's Alaric at Rome. And until next time.